Brock Lesnar, the beast incarnate, a man who threw Big Show around like a bag of groceries, a man who legitimately terrified his own locker room, a man who made John Cena, the guy who couldn't be put down by anyone, look like a crash test dummy at SummerSlam 2014. And yet, what if I told you that some of the guys walking right past Brock in that hallway were actually stronger than him? Not louder, not more explosive, not more famous, but stronger. Pound for pound, deadlift for deadlift, grip for grip. Because there are wrestlers who carried more raw physical power in their hands than Lesnar ever had, and most of you have absolutely no idea. So today we're going to change that, because these aren't rumors, these aren't internet myths. These are documented, verified, witnessed moments of inhuman strength that will genuinely make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about who the strongest man in wrestling history really is. So let's start with someone whose whole career was basically a walking argument against Brock being the strongest, Mark Henry. And people forget this man was the world's strongest man. Not a nickname WWE made up for marketing, but an actual, real, internationally competitive title. Because before he ever laced up a pair of wrestling boots, Mark Henry was setting world records in Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting at just 21 years old. And in 1995, he totaled 2,336 pounds across 3 powerlifting events: squat, bench press, and deadlift at the Junior World Championships. And that's not a WWE stat. That's a real sports record. And while Brock Lesnar is incredibly explosive, fast for his size, athletic beyond belief, with amateur wrestling credentials that are genuinely unreal, pound-for-pound brute strength in the Iron Game is a different conversation entirely. And Mark Henry has receipts that Brock simply doesn't. And here's the kicker. When both men were on the WWE roster at the same time, even Lesnar acknowledged that Henry was someone you didn't test, and that silence speaks volumes. But Mark Henry isn't the only name on this list, because there's a man that younger fans might not recognize. Bill Kazmaier, a 3-time world's strongest man and world record holder in the deadlift, squat, and bench press simultaneously, a feat that has never been replicated, who stepped into professional wrestling in the late 80s and early 90s, and even in his mid-30s, was moving weight that made trained powerlifters stop and stare, with a verified raw bench press of 661 pounds and a deadlift that crossed 900 pounds at his peak. And these aren't estimated numbers or gym stories. These are competition-verified lifts. So when you ask whether Brock Lesnar could bench 661 pounds raw, the honest answer is almost certainly not. Because Lesnar's strength is built for athleticism, for explosiveness, for combat, for throwing a 300-pound man overhead, while Kazmaier's strength was built for one thing only: moving the heaviest weight possible. And by that pure standard, it wasn't close. And then there's Big E, who might be the most quietly terrifying strong man in modern wrestling history. Because before the New Day, before the pancakes and the trombones and the infectious charisma, Big E Langston was a competitive powerlifter. And not casually, because the man raw bench pressed 575 pounds, squatted 711 pounds, and his total in competition puts him in elite territory that most professional strongmen never reach. And think about that in a wrestling context, because this is a man who on any given Monday Night Raw was out there doing comedy bits with Xavier Woods and could have, in a parallel universe, been competing for the world's strongest man title. And there are videos online of Big E doing squats in the gym that make Brock's training footage look like a warm-up. And the wild part is that Big E never even made strength his brand because he was too busy being the most entertaining man on the roster. But make no mistake, behind that smile is a man whose numbers in the weight room rival or exceed anything Brock Lesnar has ever publicly demonstrated. And speaking of numbers that don't lie, most of you probably just said who when I mentioned Ted Arcidi, and that's fair, because he had a very brief run in the WWF in 1986, and if you blinked, you missed him. But what he brought with him was legitimately historic, because Ted Arcidi was the first man in recorded history to bench press over 700 pounds in a sanctioned competition, doing it in 1985, a full year before Brock Lesnar was even born, with 705 pounds, raw, no shirt, just bar and plates. And his WWF run didn't last long because the charisma wasn't there, but his strength was undeniable, documented, and still stands as one of the most impressive raw strength achievements in the history of the sport, proving that sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who leaves too early for anyone to remember. And finally, there's someone you absolutely know, Braun Strowman, who gets compared to Brock constantly. And usually the conversation goes in Lesnar's favor because of his MMA credibility and amateur wrestling pedigree. But here's what gets overlooked. Braun Strowman came from the world of strongman competition, trained under the legendary Bobby Thompson, and before WWE, he was being groomed for the world's strongest man circuit. And he's flipped 18-wheeler trucks on television, pulled a semi-truck, and pressed opponents overhead who legitimately weighed 350-plus pounds like it was a warm-up set, because his raw functional strength, the kind you use to move large, irregular, awkward objects, is arguably more impressive than Brock's, since Lesnar's strength is refined for combat sport, while Strowman's is the kind that moves the earth. And for one brief, beautiful moment in WWE history, the booking agreed, and Braun was treated like the most physically dominant man alive. Rightly so. And here's the thing about Brock Lesnar. None of this takes away from his legacy, because he's one of the most physically gifted human beings to ever walk through a wrestling locker room, with a combination of size, speed, athleticism, and legitimate combat credentials that is almost certainly unmatched. But strength, pure, raw, don't argue with the numbers strength, is a different conversation. And the men on this list, Mark Henry, Bill Kazmaier, Big E, Ted Arcidi, and Braun Strowman, prove that the strongest man in wrestling isn't always the one holding the championship. So if you enjoyed this video, smash that like button because it genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Subscribe if you're new, drop your thoughts in the comments about who you think is the strongest wrestler of all time, and I'll see you in the next one.